Ladies and gentlemen, how about that? I just got the signal. Yeah, welcome into the committee room. Those are streaming. We've got folks across the nation. How about that are watching in? I am Aaron Bean, honored to serve in Congress for the 4th Congressional District of Florida. It's Jacksonville, the big Jacksonville area. And I also, like you, if you're here, you are also hungry for healthcare. Right now, America is yearning for healthcare that's affordable, that's accessible, that's quality driven. And I was thinking, what I'm going to say, I want to tell you about my first job. My first job was delivering papers. I delivered the newspaper, a weekly newspaper in Fernandina Beach. And I had, 40 houses that I went and knocked on their door, delivered their paper. The last house that I went to was Mrs. Skipper. She was a widow. She was old. I was young. When you're young, everybody looks old that's over 50. Not that way anymore. Everybody's young. But the last house that I would go to, she would always invite me, and she was a baker. And she baked the greatest treats, cakes, and breads on the planet. And just to be in her house, there would always be tons of products she was selling or already sold. You had to call in advance to get one of her cakes or something, but she'd always give me a slice of cake or a hot cinnamon bun or something, which was amazing. And I remember, the small towns like Fernandina Beach, there was always a community cookbook, because getting a Miss Skipper cake was the highlight of any birthday. And that's all I ever wanted I want a Miss Skipper red velvet cake. I remember in these community cookbooks that would come out from time to time, Miss Skipper would always publish her recipes. She would put out her recipes for the red velvet cake, and I would say, Mom, look at this. We can make our own Miss Skipper cake. But it never turned out the same. It never tasted like Mrs. Skipper made it. And I remember I went off to college, and I remember Miss Skipper had passed away, but they interviewed her daughter. Miss Skipper was the nicest lady on the planet, and we miss her. We miss her cakes, and we miss her. But they interviewed her daughter, and there was a story about her daughter, and her daughter, they asked her about the recipes and the cakes, and her daughter says, well, my mom was the most generous on the planet. She would bake a cake for anybody, and anytime anybody came and asked for the recipe or something, she would give it to them, but she knew that's her bread and butter. She always changed the recipe. How about that? It wasn't the recipe. She would put too much, whatever it is, she would change it up. So it wasn't the same, and so you always had to go back to Miss Skipper. My point is, we are all on a mission. I'm a man on a mission, and if you're here, you're joined us. What's the recipe for that quality, affordable, accessible healthcare system that we're all looking for on the planet right here? We don't have it yet. We know there's some choice. We know there's some competition, but we're looking for it. Now, this is an exciting journey that we didn't know who was going to come. It's fly out day, or fly out was yesterday. Who's going to come? You've come, and people are tuning in to have some of the most smartest, well-equipped people on the planet to talk about each individual ingredient that's going to go into healthcare. Our first summit, Pathway to Consensus, was dynamite. If you watched it, or if you watch it online, dynamite. The hot topic then was the ingredient of, do we need premium tax credits? Should that go in the recipe? Turns out, we don't need that. That wasn't part of the recipe for long-term success. Sure, short-term, but not long-term. As a result of policy discussions at the first consensus, we already have either are writing or in the policy or in the process of drafting legislation for a little skin in the game. Maybe everybody, because so many people were signed up without their knowledge for healthcare. Maybe they should pay $5 or something to acknowledge they're in the plan. We also talked about HSAs, health savings account. Everybody should have one. We're also looking at that policy as well. Some of the ingredients. So you're here at the right place at the right time. and we're talking about other ingredients. Now, we had the health insurance executives and the health insurance industry. They picked on some people. They picked on some other folks. They picked on the people who make our drugs. They picked on hospitals, key players. Pharma and hospitals are key players. But guess what? And now it's their turn to be on the dais, on the podium to talk about things that may be relevant that we should consider or not consider. So sit back for the next couple of hours, get ready. I wish I could sell some popcorn. That also could pay down our debt, I think, because you're in for a treat. True heavyweights, and there's only one person that could lead this first panel. Let me tell you about the panels. We're talking about 340B. 340B, drugs for charity hospitals. Is that working, not working, or should it be expanded, or should it be curtailed? We're going to talk about that. We're also going to talk about site neutrality in retrospect of hospitals. There is a friend I'd like to introduce. Is Mary Mayhew here? Is she here already? Hey, on cue right there. This is Secretary Mayhew. When I was in the legislature, she was in charge of our largest health agency overseeing health plans. It's truly a big deal to have her here, Secretary Mayhew. So welcome. You're going to be on the dais later on. How about that? So welcome, Florida Heavy. So today, for our first panel, and we got a keynote. We got a big show lined up, a big event. So today, as we launch, I'm pleased to introduce our moderator for the first panel, which is going to talk about the 340B program, charity drugs for charity hospitals. This panel, who are you going to get for this panel? We got to go to the Mac Daddy, Shane Woods, who is the VP, the Vice President of Alpine Group Partners. Everybody knows Shane on the Hill. If you're in healthcare, if you're on the Hill, then you know Shane. He's previously served as a health policy advisor for, how about this, Senator Tim Scott and Gus Bilirakis. Ladies and gentlemen, big round of applause for our moderator, Mr. Shane. Go get him, my friend. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much, Congressman, and that is a hard act to follow, let me tell you. And again, Congressman Bean, you always are bringing the energy. We love it. Thank you so much for all that you do. Thank you so much for this series and convening all of us here together to find a pathway forward. So without further ado, as the Congressman mentioned, we are talking 340B in particular. Are we making charity care easier here in the United States healthcare system, or is it just making hospital systems wealthier? So to discuss this important issue, we've got two heavyweights here on my left and on my right. We've got Bharath Krishnamurthy. He's the Director of Pharmaceutical Policy at the American Hospital Association and is based here in Washington, D.C. Bharath oversees all policy work related to drug pricing and drug payment policy. Prior to his career at the AHA, Bharath worked at another hospital trade organization and has also worked as a healthcare consultant and as a researcher at George Washington University. He completed his undergraduate and MPH degrees from the University of Virginia. So thank you so much for being here, sir. And turning over here to Karen Schwartz. Karen is the Senior Vice President in the Policy and Research Department at Pharma, where she has responsibilities for policies related to the Affordable Care Act, Medicaid, and the 340B program. Prior to joining Pharma, she worked at the Department of Health and Human Services and Kaiser Family Foundation, where she analyzed the distribution of the COVID provider relief fund. So thank you so much for being here, ma'am. All right, let's go ahead and jump on into kind of the rules of the road today. So setting expectations here, we've got a panel that will last about 45 minutes or so. There will be, unfortunately, no audience Q&A today. So my job is to make sure that we cover the hard issues. We're gonna tackle them as best we can, Congressman. And of course, we're gonna do that respectfully. And leave our audience today with ultimately a clear sense of where consensus is possible. This is a policy conversation, not a CNN crossfire old school debate, but we're going to have some fun, and we're going to talk about what Congress can do. And so, here's how we're going to do this. So I'll ask both of you guys, the same questions. Let's try to keep the answers tight today, around 1 minute each. But again, I'm not going to, hold you to that. But do the best you can, and I'll follow up where we need some potential clarity. So let's jump in here and let's start with shared definitions, because obviously lawmakers can't legislate what stakeholders can't define. So, first question. Let's start here with AHA. Bharath, in the simplest form you can, what is 340B supposed to look like? What's it supposed to accomplish in the year 2026? And what does ultimately success look like? Starting with you, sir.
Great. Thank you, Shane. And it's great to be with all of you here today. And thank you to Congressman Bean and his team for having me and the AHA here as part of this important conversation. And it's great to share this stage with Shane, you, and Karen as well. And talking about an important topic, and perhaps the first point of consensus for us is that we all agree that 340B is important. It's important for hospitals, it's important for drug companies, and most critically, it's important for patients. So to answer your question, I think we got to think about why was the program created in the first place? And we got to go all the way back to the 1980s. In the 1980s, drug prices were going up and up. Part of the reason for that was because you had the advent of brand name drugs, and Congress recognized that problem. And first, they recognized the problem that it was making it harder for the Medicaid program to afford these high-cost drugs, and so they created the Medicaid drug rebate program. And soon after that, they realized that it wasn't just the Medicaid program that was having difficulty affording these drugs. It was also safety net hospitals and other providers that were having trouble affording these drugs. And so they created the 340B program with a simple mission. The mission was to allow providers to stretch scarce federal resources to provide more comprehensive care and to reach more eligible patients. That is, in fact, the mission statement of the 340B program. So, Shane, to answer your question of what does success look like, that is the backdrop against which we need to measure success. And what I would argue is that the program is achieving that purpose or that mission. When you look at the total amount of community benefits, for example, that hospitals provided, over $100 billion in community benefits, and these range in, care provided is either not reimbursed at all or not fully reimbursed. That includes a variety of community programs and services that all directly benefit the patient. So whether it's 2026 or 2006 or 2036, I think what's important is that it is meeting the intent that Congress set forth back in 1992 when it created the program, and that is what hospitals are trying to do every day with their 340B savings.
All right. Thank you so much for that answer. Karen, over to you. Same question. What is the 340B program supposed to look like and supposed to accomplish here in the year 2026? And what does success look like?
Great. Thanks so much, Shane, and thanks to Congressman Bean for having me today and to all of you for coming for this important conversation. The pharmaceutical industry really thinks a successful 340B program would be directly helping low-income and uninsured patients afford their medicines. And unfortunately, that's not what we see today. And beyond that, the CBO recently published a report saying the 340B program has actually now grown so big that it is driving up costs for employers, patients, and the government. And unfortunately, beyond that, it's also harming community providers, including the community oncologists. Their Community Oncology Alliance has said that this program is driving local cancer doctors out of business because it's hard for them to compete with the large hospital systems that are able to purchase 340B drugs at a deep discount. And I think that's part of why we've seen a range of stakeholders from labor and employers working with members of Congress on 340B reform, because unfortunately this program that was supposed to be helping patients is now instead driving up costs.
One thing that I immediately picked up in both of y'all's answers, which on the surface seems like tons of conflict, is actually the North Star, the patient. Because whether you're wearing the lab coat of the innovator drug company or the white coat of the physician practicing in the hospital, at some point, all of us may find ourselves, or probably will find ourselves, wearing the gown of the patient, and we want to make sure that the system ultimately works for us, is aligned to us, and it serves us best. So that I am a sunny optimist, Congressman. I think we're on the road to some consensus potentially. Hallelujah, yes, sir, absolutely. So, all right, let's kind of unpack this a little bit more here. Karen, I want to start with you. Do you believe today that the 340B program is primarily a hospital support program or a patient affordability program?
Great question. I think unfortunately today it is primarily a hospital markup program, allowing large hospital systems to make hundreds of millions of dollars with no requirement that patients directly benefit through lower costs for their medical care or their prescription drugs. And unfortunately, what we see and what our members tell me is they have patients calling the prescription drug companies' patient assistance hotlines. These are patients struggling to afford their drugs. They can't afford the out-of-pocket costs that their hospital is telling them they're going to be charged for these drugs. And in many cases, it turns out these drugs were purchased by the hospital at a 340B price. Sometimes that price is just a penny, and yet the patient is struggling to pay hundreds or thousands of dollars out of pocket for their drug, and the hospital isn't even helping. They're telling them to call the pharmaceutical company. That's the kind of thing that should not be happening and that we need to address through 340B reform, and I think that's part of that recipe of affordability that the Congressman mentioned. Additionally, as Barath said, this program was created in 1992, and actually the way that most hospitals qualify for the program hasn't changed since 1992, so it has not kept up with changes in the healthcare system, and those hospitals account for 80% of all 340B sales, and now what we see is it's not just small safety net hospitals qualifying for this program. More than half of all hospitals qualify, and it includes some of the largest hospital systems, some of the wealthiest hospitals in this country. In fact, it includes a lot of the hospitals where we see celebrities go. So both Beyonce and Kim Kardashian had their babies at 340B hospitals, meaning both of them may potentially have been 340B patients.
Well, I can tell you, I have two kids at home. I unfortunately have not been to a hospital that is frequented by a celebrity. On my bucket list now. I did not know that I needed that, but that is now top of mind. But turning to you, sir, Barath, could you tell us, is 340B, the 340B program primarily a hospital support program or a patient affordability program?
Yeah, again, that's a great question. And I should note first that it's not just hospitals that participate in this program, right? This program includes hospitals, but also various other types of clinics and other providers that are eligible to participate. But I think the answer to your question, Shane, is both. These are not mutually exclusive things. Again, I go back to what was the purpose or the mission statement of the program. Congress very clearly said the program was created to allow providers to stretch scarce federal resources. What does that statement mean? It means that the program was allowed to give providers support to be able to stretch scarce federal resources. And then the second part of that statement, which is to provide more comprehensive care and reach more eligible patients. What does that mean? That means it's a patient support program. It's not just about affordability, it's also about access. And so that's what hospitals do every day. They are using the savings that they are able to get from purchasing drugs at a discount, and they're able to stretch those scarce federal resources to benefit patients, which is exactly what the program was created to do. So it's not one or the other. You don't have to pick. It's both. It's both a hospital support program, and again, not just a hospital support program. It's for clinics. It's for other types of safety net providers, and it's also a program to help patients. Now, I'll just mention what Karen talked about, a patient that went to pharmaceutical company to get, patient assistance or whatever for their copay. That doesn't sound like a 340B problem. That sounds like an insurance problem that, the insurance company isn't giving them, they don't have a great insurance or whatever. That's not a 340B problem. So, I appreciate the example, but it's certainly not a 340B problem.
Well, again, one of the things that I continue to hear both sides talk about is the patient, the patient, the patient. I like that. Let's try and keep on the consensus theme here. So let's transition and see if we can find some common ground early. So let me start with Baroth. Can you name 2 things that Karen and Pharma are right about? And I'm going to ask you to be specific, as much as you can.
Okay, I will do my best. Well, first, I think it's important to note, look, hospitals and health systems around the country recognize the value that drug companies bring. Without the innovation that drug companies do in this country every day, hospitals wouldn't be able to care for their patients. So there's certainly an important role that drug companies play in the healthcare delivery. They get paid very, very well to do that, but again, hospitals recognize that that they play a very important role. So what are a couple of things that we would agree on? So Karen alluded to this. So one is, yes, absolutely the program has grown since 1992. But we probably disagree on why it's grown, but yes, the program has grown. There is no hiding from that. And one of the reasons that it's grown is because drug companies continue to raise their prices more and more. If they didn't raise their prices more and more, you wouldn't have the Trump administration, for example, negotiating deals with these drug companies. If this wasn't a problem, you wouldn't need those deals. You wouldn't need CMMI model demonstrations to try and lower drug prices for Medicare and Medicaid patients. So this was a problem back in 1992 when the program was created. It continues to be a problem today in 2026. And so, yes, the program has grown, but it's not grown for the reasons that the drug companies will tell you. The other point that I think that maybe we'll agree on is that program integrity is very important. It was written into the law, but in order for us to have a successful program that ultimately benefits patients, you have to have program integrity. But program integrity can't just be one-sided. It can't just be program integrity for hospitals. It also has to be program integrity for the drug manufacturers. And so I think it's important when we talk about program integrity that we're talking about it both sides, that it's not just program integrity focused on the hospitals, because I'm sure Karen we'll talk about this later. I'm sure Karen will point out, there's rampant, abuse in the program from hospitals. I can point to many examples where drug companies have overcharged 340B hospitals as well. So I know we may not want to get into that because I'm sure she can cite examples and I can cite examples as well. But I think what's important here is that program integrity, I'm sure we'll agree on, is important for both hospitals as well as drug companies.
All right, appreciate that. And over to you, Karen. Again, 2 things that Baroth and the American Hospital Association are right about. And again, we'll ask for you to be as specific as you can. Thank you.
Sure. I'd like to just start by responding to some of what Baroth mentioned. First, you don't have to trust the drug companies for what are the sources of 340B growth. You can trust the Congressional Budget Office. They said that 2/3 of the growth has nothing to do with trends related to drug prices or use of it is about the 340B program inherently growing. Why was that? In part, it's because hospitals are buying up community physician practices, and then those practices become part of the 340B program. That also drives consolidation, that drives up healthcare costs. Again, addressing that part of this affordability recipe. So again, more than half of the growth, 2/3 of the growth, is driven by factors that have nothing to do with drug pricing. Separate from that, we do agree on the importance of program integrity, but I think you can't have program integrity without clear rules. And hopefully later we'll get to talk about the need for some clearer rules on hospitals and other covered entities as it relates to the 340B program, in particular, a clear patient definition. Because again, without that, you can't find things in an audit that you're not looking for, and you can't enforce clear rules that don't exist. Separately, things that I hope we can agree on are the need for greater transparency in public programs, including the 340B program. And also another issue that hasn't come up yet is concern about how much money middlemen and for-profit corporations are making off of this program. A recent congressional investigation found one middleman was made more than $1 billion from this program. I think hopefully both of us agree that's not how safety net programs should be operating.
All right, now let's get into the meat and potatoes of our program today. Now, if Congress were to, led by, of course, our esteemed Congressman here, Congressman Bean, would next month pass one bill on this issue, what would be the single biggest problem it should solve in the 340B program? Let me start with you, Karen.
Sure, thanks for that question, and I'll just start by saying, pharma supports comprehensive reform, but if I had to focus on one thing, I would say really ensuring that low-income and uninsured patients are directly benefiting from 340B through lower costs for drugs. And I think another thing probably Barath and I agree on is that sometimes there are problems with folks' insurance, and deductibles for drugs and cost sharing can be too high. That is 100% true. But if a 340B hospital is buying a drug for a penny and the patient's insurance is requiring a $200 copay, it seems reasonable to me that that drug company could step in and help this low-income or uninsured patient with that additional cost.
And Barath, over to you. Biggest problem that Congress could tackle if there was a bill next month, what would that biggest concern be?
This is a funny question because the answer I give you today will probably not be the answer I give you in 6 months, because it seems like, every day there's a new drug company effort to try and curtail the program. So, I can tell you right now the biggest concern for hospitals is an effort by the drug companies to try and turn the program from an upfront discount program to a back-end rebate program. So I think one thing that we would be supportive of, and we're hoping, pharma and others would join us in this, is to establish a neutral third-party clearinghouse that can provide claims data to this neutral entity that can then help facilitate and mitigate some of those program integrity concerns that the drug companies have, but also give confidence and some program integrity to the drug companies, so that hospitals aren't simply handing over data to the drug companies to basically do whatever they want with, but it gives an opportunity to create a neutral arbiter of all of this. I will say, just in general, again, like I said, what I'm telling you today will maybe not be what we will want to happen in 6 months, because for our hospitals, it's been like playing whack-a-mole with these restrictions. One day it's restrictions on being able to access 340B pricing through community pharmacy. The next day it's trying to turn 340B from an upfront discount to back-end rebate. The next day it's, well, forget that, we're just going to ask for the data. We want everything. We want your pharmacy claims, we want your medical claims, we want everything. And then if you don't provide that, we're not going to provide you 340B pricing. So it's very hard to keep up with this for our hospitals. And so I think, again, to answer your question, right now it's establishing a clearinghouse. But if you ask me this 6 months from now, it might be different.
I'm happy to respond on the clearinghouse and rebate issue. The clearinghouse proposals that I've seen do not have the timeframes and enforcement mechanisms in place to ensure program integrity, and these proposals are less streamlined and less efficient solutions compared to a rebate.
So for those keeping track at home, it sounds like we've got consensus on who the program is for, the patient, right, the American patient. We've got some consensus around program integrity. Now, what that looks like, still up in the air, still to be debated, still to be determined. We've got some consensus around elements of transparency. Again, what that looks like, TBD. But we can agree, at least in principle, transparency can be a good thing. Again, program integrity, transparency, the patient. All right, let's keep going. As far as a data point, if there was one data point that, if true, might make you reconsider your position on X, Y, or Z, what would that data point be, and on what issue? Let me start with you, Mr. Broth.
So I think if the drug companies can demonstrate that there is just rampant abuse by hospitals in the program, then I think we can talk about more concretely program integrity measures to stop those abuses. Frankly, when you look at the data, and this is not AHA data, by the way, this is the government audit data. When you look at that, it shows that, for hospitals, which again are a majority of the covered entities that are audited by HRSA every year, about 160 hospitals every year, and by the way, only 5 drug companies every year, it shows that the incidence to ineligible patients has cratered. It at one point was relatively high, but it has come down. Now you're only about 10% of audit findings have anything to do with duplicate discount or diversion, and those are relatively, a lot of them have to do with clerical errors that the hospital sent the wrong file to the Medicaid agency, or there was a number missing or a date missing. Some of them are a little bit more egregious, and they need to be resolved, and they are resolved. There's a statutory mechanism to resolve that, and hospitals go through that process with HRSA to resolve those issues. But if the drug companies can demonstrate, and they allege this all the time, that there is just rampant abuse in the program and therefore we need to completely upend it, then I think I would be really interested to see those numbers.
All right. Karen?
Sure. Let me just respond to that briefly. Unfortunately, you can't enforce rules that don't exist. And HRSA has essentially said they're not enforcing anything through guidance, which includes the patient definition. So we actually, there are audits happening, but it's not clear that a patient definition is being enforced. And frankly, the patient definition that's in guidance is so vague that it's hard to imagine what it would mean to enforce it. We don't have strict standards around how long you can consider somebody who once went to your hospital to be a 340B patient. If 2.5 years after they last entered the door of your hospital, they get a prescription from a community-based doctor, is that prescription eligible for 340B discounts? That's probably a point where we may disagree. And we don't have the data to know how often covered entities are considering those to be 340B prescriptions, so it's hard to even have the conversation about exactly what is abuse and not abuse in terms of a patient definition. When I think of data I would like to see that might make me rethink this program, it would be going back to the patient and ensuring that there are no patients, no low-income uninsured patients who are currently paying more out of pocket for their prescription drugs than the 340B hospital or clinic paid to buy it. There should be no markups for those patients.
Shane, can I quickly respond to that as
well?
Sure. So I actually agree with Karen. I think that it should be, certainly, I would say hospitals around the country are doing that. But I want to be clear on one thing. The program wasn't created to be a program where the discounts that hospitals achieve from the program are used only to discount drugs for patients. Now, that many hospitals do that, and that is part of it, but it's not the only aspect of the program. There are so many programs and services that 340B savings support, not to mention a lot of low-margin services that hospitals have to provide their patients and have to keep in the community, things like labor and delivery, behavioral health, that are all supported by 340B savings. These are significantly money-losing services for hospitals to keep in the community. They're only able to do that because they're able to leverage some of those 340B savings to help support that access in their community, which again, going back to why the program was created, what is the mission statement? It is to provide more comprehensive care and reach more eligible patients. And that is not just limited to reducing the cost of drugs.
I heard for the first, maybe for the first or second time today in their panel, I agree. That's a starting point. I like it. Let's keep going, people. I feel we're getting somewhere. All right, let's switch over to the patients. Before we get into a patient definition, Karen, which you've mentioned here, I want to pop over here to the tangible patient benefits. We've kind of talked about this a little bit, but I want to put a finer point on it. So let's start, Karen, with you. What are the tangible patient benefits of the program today? And if none, why not?
Unfortunately today, as I've said, there are no requirements for tangible patient benefits. We don't, see any data that shows that this program is really being used to reinvest in direct patient services. What we see when we look at hospitals after they join the 340B program, we look to see, do they provide more uncompensated care? No. Do they provide higher staffing levels? Also no. Do you know what's increasing after they join the 340B program? Their financial assets are increasing. You know, we've also looked at how much charity care 340B hospitals are providing. 2/3 of 340B hospitals provide below average levels of charity care. I think we're going to get to contract pharmacy a little later. We've looked at contract pharmacy prescriptions, 340B prescriptions filled at contract pharmacies. Less than 1% are filled with the patient having a card that ensures that 340B is going to be used to decrease their cost sharing. And I do want to talk about community benefits a little bit. That's an important issue. You know, GAO has said that community benefits is defined extremely broadly, that term is really too broad. There was a Ways and Means hearing here last year where an expert mentioned that marketing expenses are considered to be community benefits. You know, and we see some 340B hospitals doing things like buying Super Bowl ads, building movie studios, paying for stadium naming rights. These don't seem like hospitals that, you know, desperately need every 340B dollar in order to keep the lights on.
All right, Barath, over to you, sir.
Well, you know, I mean, we can quibble about the definition of community benefit, but I think at the end of the day, $100 billion is nothing to sniff at. That's a lot of money that 340B hospitals are providing patients. That's an annual number. That's not a 10-year number or, you know, since the start of the program, that's an annual number, $100 billion in 1 year they provided to communities. And that includes, like I said, free care. That includes care that they weren't fully reimbursed for. That also includes a variety of programs and services. And I think, you know, Karen, I think some of the people in Congressman Bean's district may have a bone to pick with you, because what I hear from some of them, you know, talking to, for example, patients at a Shands Jacksonville hospital, what they tell me is that 340B helps them get healthy, nutritious food at a food pharmacy that the hospital has set up for their diabetic and heart disease patients. We heard from a patient there that, you know, is suffering from diabetes, can't control her hemoglobin, wasn't able to control her hemoglobin A1C, but because the hospital was using its 340B savings to keep this food pharmacy open, by the way, during the COVID pandemic, she was able to continue to get her food, her nutritious food, that brought her hemoglobin A1C down by 5%. That's a tangible, I'm not, you know, that's not sort of an abstract impact. That is a tangible patient benefit right there, to answer your question. We also talked to Baptist Health in Congressman Bean's district. There at Wolfson Children's Hospital, they were able to use their 340B savings to expand their pediatric mental health unit from 14 beds to 21 beds. And why was that? Because they did a community health needs assessment, and that was a clear need from the community where they said that we need more, we have a crisis in the community with respect to pediatric mental health issues. And so we need more care. And so what did the hospital do? They leveraged their 340B savings, expanded their inpatient psych unit to be able to take care of more children with mental health. That, again, is a tangible patient benefit. Now, that's not going to show up in charity care. That may not even show up in uncompensated care. But you can't tell me that that's not a real patient benefit.
So lost my mic there. So so both sides here taking some broad sides. All right. Okay. I think now might be the time to start pivoting into the actual definition of the patient. So with that, let me start with you, Karen. Do we need a statutory definition of the 340B patient, a 340B patient? If yes, this is going to be a multi kind of tertiary question here, so it's a tiramisu of questions. What should it be? How do we avoid, obviously, restricting care access for underserved populations? And is it fair to say pharma would, accept? And again, we understand we're not, hard negotiating here. would accept a clearer definition if it's workable and it doesn't restrict access.
Yeah, that's a great question. We do believe strongly that there needs to be a clear and enforceable patient definition in statute, and that definition needs to require a strong link between the covered entity visit, the prescribing provider working at that covered entity, and the medicine that was prescribed. And we talk about this, I talk about this as a patient definition. I think what it really is a prescription definition. I think about myself. I have one doctor at a 340B hospital. Prescriptions from that doctor are fair game. Those should be 340B. But other prescriptions that I get from community-based providers really shouldn't be 340B, even if I happen to have been to the 340B hospital within the last few years. And, I think that kind of a definition would, if anything, help access because, again, there's no requirements that right now, today, the program help with access. And in fact, given that this program is driving up healthcare costs and decreasing the number of community providers, it could actually be harming access. So a stronger definition could actually be helpful. And I do just want to go back and touch on some of the great work being done by hospitals in Congressman Bean's district. We want this program to be sustainable so that it can work for true safety net hospitals. But when more than half of all hospitals participate, including, hospitals running Super Bowl ads, the hospitals Kim Kardashian goes to, that is, and the program's driving up healthcare costs, it really raises concerns about the sustainability of the program overall.
Okay. Roth?
Well, I'm not sure, we can dictate which hospital Kim Kardashian or Beyonce go to. They go to whichever hospitals in their community. But that being said, we won't belabor that point too much. When it comes to patient definition, look, there already exists one. Now, pharma may not like it, but there's already a patient definition that exists. HRSA has had it since 1996. The most important thing when we're talking about patient definition is that it needs to, one, be flexible, and two, it needs to be durable. Here's why. Because the way that healthcare is being delivered in this country is changing rapidly as we speak. We have telehealth. We have AI that's emerging, new ways to deliver care. And who knows what's going to happen 10 years from now. I'm sure Congress does not want to be legislating patient definition every 5-10 years as the way that the way healthcare is being delivered changes. So I think what you need is a patient definition, which I would argue already exists, but you need a patient definition that is flexible and durable to accommodate the changes that we will see, not only now, but in the future of how care is being delivered. That includes things, again, like telehealth, AI, and things like that. Referrals are a big part of it. And so I think when we're talking about who is a patient, yes, there does need to be rules. And we'll get into, why there needs to, there should be rules on covered entities. There also needs to be rules on drug companies too. It's both ways. But that this patient definition does need to be broad enough to accommodate all those different aspects of how healthcare is delivered in this country.
Okay, and I'm looking over here. I'm checking on our time. How are we doing? All right, excellent. I'm getting the signal here. I'm just going to go ahead and transition here to the very end. If you've got Congressman Bean sitting right over there, that guy. If he were to stop you out in the hall and say, you know what, backstage, one sentence, what could he say both sides agree on today? Let me start with you, Barath.
Well, maybe he can say... Well, maybe he can say we agree to disagree on a lot of things. No, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. No, but in all seriousness, I think that there is, we obviously agree that, one, there should be transparency. It's important for policymakers as well as the public to know that the 340B program is working as Congress intended. I would argue that it is, but I would also argue that the transparency needs to be two-sided. Whatever we talk about, whether it's program integrity, transparency, it can't just be one-sided. It's got to go both ways because there are multiple stakeholders that participate in the 340B program. So we can't just be focused on one side of the equation. It has to be both-sided. So I would say, to Congressman Bean, I really appreciate you putting on this pathway to consensus. I think it's really important. Again, I think one place we agree on is that 340B is very important. And at the end of the day, we're both here talking about a program that patients benefit from and should continue to benefit from for many, many years to come. So thank you.
Thank you, Barack. Karen.
Sure. Again, thanks for the opportunity to be here today. I would agree we both support the 340B program. We both want it to continue. I think we want it to be sure that it is helping vulnerable patients. I hope that's something we can agree on. I think maybe where we might disagree is on whether we need new standards and rules for covered entities just to ensure that that's happening.
All right, and Congressman Bean, I think that's how it's done. I think we've got some consensus here that's forming. So again, really appreciate your time today. Thank you so much for inviting us. Thank you to our panelists as well. And Congressman, the floor is yours.
Ladies and gentlemen, a big round of applause for our first panel. Thank you. Hey, see, y'all thought I was just making that up when I said there's only one guy. There's only one guy that can lead our first panel. That's Shane Woods. Shane, you brought the energy. I'm an energy guy, and you did that too. I'm going to ask everybody to stand. Let's get a picture real quick before we dismiss you. Everybody, Karen, well done. Congratulations. Thank you so much. Barack, thank you so much. You gave me a couple shout-outs too. Talked about my own hospitals. Thank you so much. All right, here we go. We're going to get a pic before we bring up our next panel. Hooray! Well done. Thank you very much, Shane. I'm serious. Wow. Don't run against me in Northeast Florida, Shane, because that energy right there. Our next panel, come on up. Chris Jones is going to be introducing everybody in just a few minutes. We got Mary Mayhew, some other hospitals, and so many things happening. Shane, you took us further down the path to consensus than I imagined. And you said that word several times, consensus. That's what we have to build, as we're talking about. For many of you who just came in, so many people. I'm Aaron Bean. I have the honor of representing Northeast Florida in Congress, and we are hungry for the recipe. What does that recipe look like for health care? So many ingredients. 340B, there was consensus on reform is necessary on both sides. And thanks to Shane to draw that out of both of our panelists. I know they studied all week, and I know we have so many people tuning in online. Our numbers continue to go up. And thank you so much. Our next panel, did you see USA Today yesterday? The cover of USA Today talked about folks that went to their doctor's office. They got the bill, and then next thing you know, they get another bill, a facility fee for their hospital, and it was a surprise to them. Now, I can tell you both sides of the argument of why that fee is necessary, why I could tell you what both sides say, or I could just introduce the next panel, because that's what it's all about: site neutrality, how we're going to pay for hospitals in the future, and maybe that plays a role or not. We've got some great folks that are focused like a laser on this issue, and they're here to bring you their side of the story. So let me introduce. Now, just like Shane Woods with our first, there's only one guy that can lead this panel, because we've got true heavyweights on both sides of the aisle. One guy, a guy who used to work for Congressman Bill Aracus in the healthcare arena, and then was drafted by the Energy and Commerce Committee also to work on healthcare. Today, he is in charge of lobbying and I guess government outreach, government affairs for a group called BIO, which also is in the discussion of this healthcare, national healthcare discussion, BIO. So ladies and gentlemen, our moderator who will introduce our panelists and kick it off. And by the way, nobody's going anywhere after this panel. We've got a great keynote speaker that's going to talk about more healthcare and reconciliation part 2. What? Reconciliation Part 2, is that even a thing? Maybe. Brittany Madney is going to talk about it, and she's also a great thinker. So with that, let's get to our panel number 2. Ladies and gentlemen, our moderator is Chris Jones. Chris, take it away, my friend. Good luck.
Thank you, Congressman Bean. We really appreciate you doing this, and I will just say Shane Woods is a very tough act to follow. He is a good friend and a mentor of mine, so appreciate the invite. Really appreciate the Congressman and his staff, Richie Lemura, for hosting this series, providing a forum where we can ask the tough policy questions and in a way that is designed to find common ground. So these are not easy policies to talk about, but really want to thank the audience for being here. Thanks to everyone who is tuning in for our second panel debate of the afternoon, entitled, I think very aptly, Location, 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 a conversation about site-neutral payments. Today's discussion focuses on a core Medicare policy question. Should Medicare pay the same rate for the same service regardless of whether it is delivered in a hospital outpatient department or a physician office? Before we get into it, I want to set the table a little bit with a couple of points of background for everyone so we can understand where we have been and where we are now. Site-neutral payment policy is certainly not new. It has been debated for many years, particularly as policymakers look at the long-term sustainability of the Medicare program and possible adverse incentives created by payment differentials, while also ensuring that hospitals remain a critical access point for our communities across the country, particularly in rural and underserved areas. Nevertheless, research findings highlighted the facts. Medicare often reimburses hospitals at higher rates than independent physician offices for delivering the same service. Establishing site-neutral payments has been a focus for CMS and MedPAC for more than a decade, and Congress actually took a major step in this direction when it enacted the Bipartisan Budget Act of 2015, which required that most services delivered in newly established off-campus outpatient departments be reimbursed at the Medicare physician fee schedule rate. These new site-neutral rates were about 60% lower than the standard OPPS reimbursement. However, the law was grandfathered in for all existing sites, which were allowed to continue to receive the OPPS rate. More recently, Congress took another pass at site neutrality in the Lower Costs and More Transparency Act of 2023, a bipartisan bill that proposed site-neutral payments in Medicare for drug administration services. This bill passed the House, but ultimately did not make it across the finish line in the Senate. I have my own thoughts about that as a House guy, but this year, the admin, the Trump administration actually did decide to take on that policy themselves in the OPPS regulatory final rule for calendar year 2026, and has moved forward in applying site-neutral payments for drug administration, regardless of site of care, marking a pretty significant regulatory change. This panel is going to explore the fiscal, clinical, and access implications of site-neutral payment policies, and also discuss where there may be some commonalities and path to consensus. We all share an interest here in helping the conference, the GOP conference, but also just the Congress at large to find ways to lower costs for our seniors. And we're fortunate to have a terrific group. I got 2 and 2 on each side, representing both sides of the debate. So I'll ask each of them now to briefly introduce yourselves and share your view on this particular issue with some opening remarks. So I will start with my, on my right, Dr. Misha.
Okay, I think I'm on now. First and foremost, I would like to thank Congressman Bean for having me. I'm Asmita Mishra. I have the pleasure of being a physician from the Moffitt Cancer Center, where I've worked for over a decade. By trade, like I said, I'm a physician and I treat blood cancer patients by means of allogeneic transplant, more commonly known as bone marrow transplant. I'm getting caught in my words here this afternoon. But for the purposes of this afternoon, I'm also the medical director of payer strategies for the institution, which means I'm a liaison and an advocate for patients and the providers at the institution as they navigate the complexities of insurance companies. I am on the con side of site neutrality. Given that we give very complex treatments and treat very complex patients at our HOPD sites, site neutrality would have significant impacts to our institution and curtail our ability to give those complex treatments. So I will pass it to my left.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Congressman, thank you. Secretary. Thank you. Great introduction. Previously, delighted to be here. I'm Mary Mayhew, President and CEO of the Florida Hospital Association. I have been in that role for about 5.5 years. Prior to that, as the Congressman mentioned, I was Secretary for the Florida Agency for Healthcare Administration. I had the honor and privilege of serving in that role at the beginning of the pandemic. I was responsible for all the hospitals, nursing homes, and assisted living facilities, along with the state Medicaid program. Truly, this is an issue that is near and dear to my heart. Prior to my arrival in Florida, with my brief layover in D.C. that you reminded me of at CMS, I served for many years in the state of Maine, overseeing a state agency there. And it is a state, like many rural states, where physicians were struggling to stay afloat. And generally we're seeking the assistance of hospitals in order to preserve local access, pediatricians, OBGYNs, family providers, hemorrhaging red ink, and needed the system engagement of hospitals and healthcare systems in order to remain viable, to continue to provide high-quality healthcare systems and to benefit from the engagement of a broader healthcare system. So I am very much opposed to the simplicity of a slogan. It's not neutral in terms of what we expect from our, not just expect, but what we need from our health systems. And again, we can talk about this in greater detail, but I've had the added vantage point of watching the healthcare system respond, certainly as it related to the pandemic, but unfortunately in Florida also as it relates to hurricanes and what our expectations and needs are of that broader health system, which is part of the financial infrastructure that's needed to support those services.
Hi, my name is Anna Bonelli. I'm the Director of Health Policy at the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. Congressman Bean, thank you so much for having me. You took all my talking points. I have nothing left to say. No. So the committee is one of the only organizations dedicated to addressing issues related to the federal budget in a nonpartisan way. And as you probably know, we currently have $38 trillion in federal debt. And Medicare is one of the primary drivers of this debt. As time goes on, that squeezes out opportunities for everything we want, all priorities, including our wonderful hospitals that we absolutely treasure and that do God's work. And so there have to be places in our budget where we say, I'm sorry, but we are just no longer going to be able to provide funds in this way. And we think that site-neutral policy is a very sensible, nonpartisan or bipartisan opportunity for change that could help to reduce our federal deficit and perhaps repurpose some of those funds in a way that addresses actual policy problems. Site-neutral policy was the policy that we have right now that is not site-neutral was established to help hospitals and hospital outpatient departments address the needs of high complexity patients. There's a lot of sense to that. But over time, it's been exploited, and now it costs about $150 billion over 10 years and is being used to finance other portions of hospital systems, which it was never intended to do. So we would be in favor of going back or establishing a site-neutral payment policy for our fiscal future.
Hi, everyone. My name is Michael Baker. I'm the Director of Healthcare Policy at the American Action Forum. Thank you to the Congressman and his team for the invitation, and really looking forward to the conversation today. There are a lot of things in the healthcare system that need support. We know that density across the country can be an issue. We know that bystander capacity can be an issue. But there are certain policies that end up impeding the market in a way that doesn't allow a true reflection of the cost and the price of what something should be paid for. And so I think, and site neutrality is an example of this, where there are a lot of spaces where the cost of providing the care is different. In a hospital, obviously, there are more associated costs. But in the independent physician setting, those costs are simply not there. And so it seems incongruous, at best, to say that the price should be exactly the same. We know that people are currently struggling with the idea and the value of what they pay for healthcare and what they receive. And a simple fix to start us down a trajectory to provide more affordability, to provide more transparency, is that site neutrality. And then long term, allowing some of that payment to float, allowing some of that payment to be more reflective of market conditions, in the long run can create a more sustainable, not only federal healthcare system, but the healthcare system more broadly.
Okay. Thank you all. I wanted to kick off our first question by talking about the Medicare financing side of things. As we all know, the program faces some long-term financing pressures, and per enrollee spending has increased substantially in the last few years for Medicare in particular at 5.5%. Almost half of all health expenditures are in public programs. And we don't expect that to slow down over time. We expect it to increase. Congress has taken an eye on sustainability of this particular critical program for seniors, as well as looking at, more recently, this Congress, issues of affordability for beneficiaries directly. Where does site-neutral payment policy fit into this broader conversation about sustainability and affordability? I'll turn it to Anna first.
Yeah, great question. Okay, so the Medicare program is, depending on who's doing the math, the third or fourth leading or third or fourth top budget item for the United States government. It's financed in a couple different ways, and I want to be clear that we're not talking about the trust fund, okay? I get paid every time I mention the word trust fund, so just want to get that out there. But hospitals are paid from Part A, and that's financed by a trust fund. That's not what we're talking about today, okay? The trust fund's going to be insolvent in about 6 years. Good to know. But what we're talking about in this conversation is Part B. Part B is funded by a trust fund, but it's like not really. You can essentially think of it as deficit financed in many ways, okay? It comes from general revenues. So Part B is actually growing quite a bit faster than Part A. And so this conversation is particularly relevant. One of the reasons that it has been growing is due to the fact that we don't have site-neutral policies. So again, this is a Part B conversation. It's paid from general revenues. Medicare as a whole is projected to cost $16 trillion over the next 10 years. $16 trillion. We need to look for as many ways as we possibly can to moderate that cost. And I'm really glad you mentioned affordability. The costs that the federal government is paying are also reflected by what beneficiaries and consumers have to pay. So as that trajectory goes up and up and up, as the federal government's payments go up and up, same for beneficiaries. In Part B, bennies pay approximately 25%. of the cost of care. So as we continue to not pay site-neutral rates, beneficiaries pay more and more as time goes on. And then, of course, Medicare sets the standard for commercial payment as well. We all know this. Like Medicare sets all the standards for fee-for-service in the commercial sector. So as a result, as Medicare rates are high, those higher rates are also reflected in the commercial sector, and therefore affordability declines over time as well. So, your employer-sponsored insurance plans are also paying non-site neutral rates because they're following on with Medicare, which makes your premiums and your co-pays go up over time.
And just to build on that, because I think it's an incredibly important point that the trust fund is not the issue today. It's an issue for a different conversation, but not today. And because Part B is funded not just out of the general treasuries, but by premiums, when you reach some level of, not insolvency, but we're going to use that word as a shorthand for this conversation, when you reach that insolvent level at some point, your premiums will go up by tens or hundreds of percents. And so that's not a benefit cut necessarily on the one side. It's actually more money that's going to be coming out of your pocket. And any policies that we can adopt to sort of push that horizon out until we can have longer sustainability, I think is a really important trade-off, because this simply doesn't go away. It then becomes foisted on you as a consumer.
I'll turn it over to Mary for a response.
Do you want to reach agreement already?
That would be ideal.
Okay. Look, I don't think anybody would disagree that we're on an unsustainable path in our healthcare system. And the challenge of affordability is something we all are concerned about and take very seriously. What is difficult is when we kind of suspend reality and we choose what could be a very simplistic approach without necessarily understanding the broad implications. Where's the congressman? Is the congressman over there? Congressman. It would be like comparing the Tallahassee airport to Atlanta. Okay, they're not the same. What Tallahassee provides, other than 1970s music, very different than a broad hub that is Atlanta. What I think is also, first of all, there are things that we need to be talking about. We want individuals, patients, to get the right care at the right time and in the right setting. The amount of preventable health care utilization that is occurring in this country is staggering in terms of the billions of dollars. I want the Medicare Advantage plans to be focused on improved care coordination. So I think from an affordability, there's a lot that we can focus on. What frustrates me about this argument is that for years we've been driving toward more comprehensive approach to care, to reduce the fragmented nature of care, to stop the islands of treatment. We all want a warm handoff from the family physician to the specialist. I don't want to be carrying my MRI in a manila folder to the next specialist, and I don't want to have to repeat my healthcare history. I want them to know it, to have digested it, and to have provided me with a comprehensive view because they're part of a team and they have health information technology. So they're not the same, and I think we have to acknowledge that. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't be looking for the opportunities to improve and drive rational health care spending and affordability.
Thank you so much for that, Mary, for teeing that up. So my personal take on this is that site neutrality is likely to exacerbate the problem. In current state, looking at oncology specifically, greater than 70% of oncology care is given in an outpatient setting. So for example, at Moffitt, we give chemotherapy, IV antimicrobials, IV electrolytes, blood transfusions, given by physicians, specialized nursing staff, and have all the emergency services, all given in an outpatient setting with all the ancillary support. With site neutrality, that would all have to be curtailed. In many other sites that are non-HOPD based, that is done at an inpatient setting. And so without all of that support, all of that will be driven to an inpatient site. That would further balloon costs. And so I think that has to be taken very seriously. When outpatient reimbursement is reduced, hospital cost of care will increase. That further exposes patients to hospital infections, potentially more procedures, potentially more radiographic exams that are unnecessary, further increasing the cost of care. So to Mary's point, I think we have to look at this orchestrated care that is being given at these specialized sites very carefully.
It's interesting to hear, Mary, you talked about Medicare Advantage plans.
Don't get me started.
A couple of weeks ago, there was a pretty high-profile hearing, I heard, may have been watching, in this exact room with the insurance CEOs who put forth a lot of arguments blaming, frankly, I think, hospitals for driving spending growth through higher outpatient prices. How do you respond to that critique? What do you think is context that would be missing from that particular narrative? And then I'm happy to turn it over to the other side.
You know, it's interesting. Sometimes I feel like I'm often put in the situation of having to defend the irrational. So, I mean, it's easy to ask, so how come that independent imaging center down the street, the price for their MRI is so much less than the hospital? I say, because they're not delivering babies. I mean, it takes me longer to explain that than the system that exists. You know the analogy of someone who's spinning plates and they're trying to make sure that none of the plates fall. That's our hospital and health system today. Someone who's going to medical school now is graduating potentially with $500,000 in debt. They can't open up a small business anymore. They need the model of a health system and the employment, never mind the team, the access to the investments, the modernization. We've had labor and delivery units closing throughout Florida. We have OBGYN deserts. Our OBGYNs in Florida pay over $250,000 a year in medical malpractice premiums. They can't afford it. We've had inpatient psychiatric units close. They're hemorrhaging red ink. Our labor and delivery from Medicaid pays 47 cents on the dollar of cost. Medicaid pays for over 40% of all the births. The math doesn't work. But anyone, whether you're on Medicaid, commercial, when you're expecting a baby, you don't want to drive a great distance to be able to deliver your baby. And so these hospitals, not just trying to maintain status quo, I would say, look, you don't want health care that's from 2006. You want health care from 2026 and beyond. Boy, when you need it, you want it. I just recently was at a children's hospital and they put the virtual reality goggles on me, and there I was holding a pediatric heart. And what they are doing is now allowing the most minimally invasive open heart surgery on newborns at the bedside. That's investment. That's modern. That's sophisticated. That's what is being paid for in this structure of a health system. So there's nothing neutral about these services that are part of a broader health system.
Actually, I'll turn it over to
what the question was, but
I'll kick us off. You can fill in the blanks. I do not have as good of stories as Mary. Like, you guys have absolutely wonderful examples, and I mean, I have treasured the care that I and my family have gotten at hospitals. They are absolutely doing God's work. I know I'm like the cold, hard accountant over here. I don't know, but you should still listen to me because I mean, what I hear you saying is all very true. The health system has many, many problems, and some parts are underfunded. This is not one of them. This is an example of an opportunity that started out really small and has grown and been exploited over time such that non-site neutral payments are subsidizing all of these other wonderful things that we need and we care about. If we need and care about those things, great. We should totally pay for them. We should pay what they're worth, and we should pay them adequately such that, professionals are compensated adequately, et cetera. But we can't have every single thing that we want in the entire world. There have to be places where we cut back. And public policy school taught me that you should pay for the things that you want to happen. You shouldn't take one opportunity that's very similar to 340B and use it to subsidize something else that it was never intended for.
And I think what's important and what both Mary and Anna have said is that the underlying issue with operating a hospital and operating the health systems that we now rely on and live in is that there are underlying cost issues. And sometimes those cost issues have nothing to do with a Medicare reimbursement rate. They have to do with, you brought up the medical school loans. It's about labor, it's about energy, it's about the building materials. And this is not what this panel is about, but it is a reminder to say that relying on a senior healthcare system to support much needed, but nonetheless pediatric advancement is something that I think we should be really cognizant of, because both panels have been talking about it. We will continue talking about it because affordability is the word of the day and the word of the week and the word of the month. But I think a person who's struggling to afford their health care isn't really thinking about whether or not they're willing to support a medical medical school loan payments. And I think that funding bystander capacity is an important piece of things, particularly when we talk about rural hospitals. We talk about very narrow ways to access that care, and that probably deserves a separate conversation. But again, sort of funding it out of a pot of money that it was never intended to fund it, I think begins to make the policy. It begins to make Medicare unsustainable. It begins to make us have to have hard conversations that I don't think we need to be having.
Can I respond to that? No.
I'm not sure what the original question was.
It's okay.
But I think we have to, going to this particular question, I think we're taking it out of context because we're looking at a single sliver of the care continuum. So we're looking at one single piece, not the whole arc of the care. And so I think we have to be extremely careful about that. And so I'm talking about oncology here. So there's the diagnosis, the treatment, the maintenance, the survivorship. It is the whole arc. So when you look at a single sliver, it can look like, well, isn't treatment here, that particular treatment here and here, why do they cost so different? And that is an extremely myopic view. And so please bear with me on a case that was just presented to me in the last 24 hours. So a very young adolescent had a diagnosis of lymphoma, was being treated at a community practice, received a certain number of cycles and was told was refractory to that treatment, and was recommended to get radiation to their entire chest, and then was on a plan to get that radiation treatment and subsequently more aggressive chemotherapy and transplant. Thank goodness that patient and family was like, okay, time out, I want to get a second opinion. Came to our center. When they came to our center, we had the benefit of a multidisciplinary team. So that case was evaluated by not only a lymphoma expert, but a radiologist who looked at the scans, a pathologist who looked at the path slides, and a transplant specialist, amongst a whole other team of physicians. And what was determined is that the pathologist looked at the diagnosis, confirmed that the diagnosis was indeed correct, but that maybe the original chemotherapy should have could have been different because of the features of the pathology. What the radiologist also determined on the repeat PET was that the patient was actually not refractory to care, but was actually reactive lymph nodes to the chemotherapy that the patient was receiving, and was absolutely not refractory and should not be receiving radiation to the major organs in the chest, and that poor young adult could have potentially been radiated to the heart and lungs. And then the lymphoma specialist quickly put them on a different type of chemotherapy, better suited. Transplant doctor said definitely doesn't need transplant, but probably this patient would likely benefit from cellular immunotherapy, a CAR T clinical trial instead, all to be given at a HOPD outpatient site closer to the patient's home in a rural part of Florida. I mean, thank goodness that patient came to us, and that is the benefit of our center and a HOPD site, and that is an issue of access, a structural place for that patient to get it, clinical acumen. I mean, I could go on and on about this, and so that is the benefit of having these sort of sites be available.
It's actually a great segue into kind of my next thread, which was about these policies not necessarily being in a vacuum, although I wish it was the case, having also went to public policy school down across the river. We talk about these policies often in the abstract here. But nothing in reality is in a vacuum. And we know that there are, particularly looking at some of the potential unintended consequences or unintended kind of outcomes of that 2015 law. We know that there were attempts, or there were actually successful follow-on efforts to ensure that there were additional exceptions made as a result of that. So I wanted to turn it over to you, Mary, to speak to the patient populations that you serve, that your hospitals serve, whether it be, and kind of the unique role that they play in their communities in a very real way. What differentiates them from local physician practices who can at times set up wherever they want. How are you all unique, and why are you deserving of this kind of higher rate?
I really think, again, it's important. The world has changed dramatically. These are not just the hospital that we typically associate with that one building. And not necessarily because they've wanted to employ physicians, purchase practices. That has happened out of a necessity to preserve access. So this notion of gobbling up practices has never been an accurate depiction. And it truly, our bigger challenge is with insurance companies purchasing physician practices. Hospitals are looking across the continuum of care. Again, think about the readmissions policy, right? Hospitals are financially penalized for preventable readmissions. Well, one way you affect and drive that down is to help support the kind of services in the community, the warm handoffs, that discharge planning, the home health, the physician, to support that. But I want to come back to the hospital isn't divided well. These services are paid for by Medicare patients. These services are solely for Medicaid, and these are the commercial. I mean, frankly, if we want to talk about anybody who's subsidizing, it's the employer commercial private pay that are having to pick up the tab of government payers that have somehow rationalized forever that it's okay to pay far less than cost. It's ultimately that all ends have to meet, and not just meet, because meeting, just breaking even, our wages, the nurses we all depend on, the physicians we all depend on, our wages have gone up nearly 30% in the last 3 years. Pharmaceutical supplies, we just talked about that. So almost 60% of a hospital's budget in the last 2 or 3 years has gone up over 30%. So ends have to meet, but also you want to keep pace with the advancements, the modernization, the technology, and it's across a continuum. So I always use this phrase, and then I realize how old I am when I say Marcus Welby. It doesn't exist anymore. The landscape has changed. And again, the regulatory requirements that exist with these hospital-based practices and clinics is just fundamentally different. The quality, the safety expectations. But I really want to lean in on the expectations we have around the health information technology, the clinical standards and expectations from being part of this larger system. And the notion, and I'm concerned about the coinsurance and the cost sharing. Okay, so I am concerned about that. And we do need to think about how we focus on that. But, and the interesting debate that often happens around property taxes with people who don't have kids in school. They don't want to pay, but you're paying for a system-wide that we all ultimately benefit from.
Michael?
Yeah, and Mary, I appreciate that perspective, and I think something that you said that I want to key in on is that hospitals and health systems are taking...
First of all, do you know who Marcus Welby is?
Sure.
Oh, my God.
Yes.
But start doing Saturday Night Live now. Okay.
But I think one thing that's really important that you highlighted is how medical care has evolved, how health systems have evolved, and what they can do and are responsible for. And one of the reasons that that's so interesting is because in addition to how health systems have changed their provision of care, patients have changed how they access that care, generally speaking. I think the pandemic taught us a lot of lessons. I know those of us who were in government, it taught us a lot of lessons at the time. But I think one of the things that it has really done, and we've seen this in the health extenders part of the appropriations bill that just passed, is that telehealth, for example, has grown drastically and has a central place in how we think about healthcare. The moves that CMS has made to focus in on health tech and for prevention and treatment, just the different avenues that we now have available to us and we are now seeking payment for and coverage of. I would struggle to say that we should continue that all of that can change and that all of our access should change, but we shouldn't change how we pay for that. And I think that's not to say, we talk a lot about site neutrality in the context of immediately if site neutrality was enacted, that all prices in physician offices would go down. I think that's actually not the case. MedPAC has done some studies on this. Other independent reviewers have done studies on this where some of those prices actually go up. As compared to what they're billed for under the physician fee schedule. But I think site neutrality helps to reset some of that market to say, how are we paying for this? Who's covering this? And I think gives an opportunity not only for the health systems, but for the payers and for patients to figure out a better way about what price they're comfortable with, because ultimately, Anna mentioned this earlier, and we all know this to be true. You mentioned the private payers. Medicare has a role in the private market that, whether it's deserved or not, I think this is, again, another debate, but it is a price setter regardless, and why we wouldn't want that to allow some innovation, to allow some value to percolate into the rest of the coverage market, I think should be a consideration as we talk about whether or not certain facilities or certain services need some site neutrality.
The only thing that I would just comment on, and I think we all would like to see opportunities that drive exactly what you just described in terms of the efficiency, the streamlining, let's address the right incentives. This policy is really a symptom of and not getting at the core. It's like pulling that thread that just unravels. And that's unfortunately, we've got these layer upon layer upon layer of the regs, of the payments, and it creates the perverse challenges that we face. What we don't want are the unintended consequences where we don't have the surge capacity in the system, we're not getting the Da Vinci robots, we're not supporting the timely access, and on and on and on. We all want to come back and say, is the system driving efficiency, quality, timely access, and producing the best possible outcomes? It's the age-old, it's tough to unscramble the egg, but let's just make sure we don't do it in such a way, and because government isn't really looking out at, are we training the next generation? Are we meeting we're going to have over 6 million individuals in Florida over the age of 65 in a few short years. The demand on health care is skyrocketing. And when we look at chronic diseases among that population, we don't have enough beds. I want us to reimagine how care can be delivered, but I don't want us to have it with our hand tied behind our back because we keep nibbling away at things that sound simple and easy but lead to unintended consequences.
I think you hit the nail on the head. So the best way to decrease costs is prevention and screening, right, in any disease state. And particularly in the rural communities when you have healthcare deserts, when people don't have access to healthcare in an easy, feasible way, it makes access to healthcare, particularly in the outpatient setting, longer, right? And so people come to the hospital at much later stages in their disease, which increases healthcare costs. So you want to make it much more efficient for patients to get to these outpatient centers more quickly. And so that is the unintended consequence, right, of some of these potential policies, and that's the concern. And certainly in the cancer space, that is one of our biggest concerns, is that they come at a much, much, much later stage in their disease course. But that's true even in heart disease, hypertension, diabetes, and so the chronicity is a problem. And we know that in rural states, rural communities, right, that these patients come at a much more advanced position and they utilize emergency rooms at a much higher frequency.
Hannah?
Yeah, I want to pick up on the thread of unintended consequences. This is something that we've mentioned and talked a little bit about, but just a reminder of one of the key unintended consequences of the 2015 law, which again, grandfathered in existing clinics. So those existing clinics could have the non-site neutral rate. So as a result of this bill, or as a result of that law, hospitals started buying up clinics. So these are just your doctor's offices, around the corner. These are doctor's offices that people have been going to for years. And as a result of that law, and as a result of hospitals buying up these doctor's offices, now you have these massive health systems. So what happens? Well, on the one hand, you have individuals, like my mom or something, will go to their doctor's office and all of a sudden they find, oh, now I have to pay a facility fee, or now my coinsurance or my copay is higher because it was bought by a hospital and it's no longer it's no longer billed at the physician fee schedule, it's now billed at the OPPS rate. So that is one of the unintended consequences. The other is that we have these massive health systems, and as you indicated, Mary, it's not like nefarious. It's not that, hospitals are, trying to take over the universe or anything. But when they start buying all these practices, now they have market power. And now insurance, it's really hard for them to do their job. Now insurance companies don't have the market power, but the hospital systems do. And so hospital systems can command higher rates. And that drives up rates for everybody. So there are a lot of downstream effects that make it really hard for us to save money in our health system.
Wait, I got to go tell the hospitals. I got 30% of my hospitals with negative margins. They're doing something wrong then, because those practices are not garnering them. I mean, frankly, in Florida in particular, but happening around the country, the role of private equity is forcing more and more physicians to form a parade outside of the hospital saying, man, you got to bail us out. The private equity firm came in, was great for the physician about to retire, but not for the 40-year-old physician. And so that is putting hospitals between a rock and a hard place, making the decision to take on these practices. So I think again, I understand the concern, and we should all be looking at the challenges of the cost sharing and the transparency, but we can't suspend reality and not understand these hospitals are being asked to do broad community health assessments and then respond to the broad needs of these communities, which is encompassing all of these decisions to provide these services.
Yeah, and I think you were thinking about solutions, right? And some transparency, and your point is well taken. And to Mary's point, in over a decade, there's been a six-fold increase in private equity purchasing. So I think, and consolidation. So I think that's definitely something that needs to be further looked at. And Chris, I think your question at some point was about insurance companies. And
this is great.
You know, and I think, you know, another thing that Congress certainly, and Representative Bean, you can help us on is the vertical integration that's happening there. So substantial vertical integration with PBM, specialty pharmacy, and physician practices as well there, right? So things that certainly we need more transparency on, as well as we look to ways that we can reduce cost.
Yeah, that's. I'm sensing certainly. I think a thread that consolidation in the marketplace is not good, and there does need to be transparency. It's certainly a focus of the administration to look at transparency, and so I think with kind of maybe the final closing question that I would propose is with an eye towards looking towards some commonalities here. Where would you propose, perhaps it could be transparency, it could be, I know that there's been some, back to the lower cost, more transparency bill that was passed by the House, a policy that had a national provider identifier number to ensure that services are being tracked exactly where the service is taking place. Are there, what are places in which hospital systems can provide some common ground here? Is it transparency? Is it we need to be looking at private equity? We need to be looking at student loans? Where can we find this common ground? It's my final question.
Okay, I guess I'm up first. So in the spirit of our last 45 minutes, we've been sort of answering our own questions at our own discretion. So what I'll say is the American Cancer Society 2026 report that was just released noted a 5-year relative survival for oral cancers of greater than 70%, which was historic. From the report, and I will quote, is that the future progress is threatened by reductions in federal funding for health care. And so what I would say is that I urge Congress to lean in. That 70% survival was due to prevention and screening efforts for clinical trials, for new drug development. That is how we got there. It is due to all the investment that we have made in all these years in multidisciplinary care. It is all the innovation that has been made in coordinated care. And so what I hope to see is that we will continue in that vein to be innovative and continue all of this multidisciplinary care that we have spent so much infrastructure on and not walk that back. And the last thing I will say, which is small potatoes in comparison to all the things that we have talked about, is that much of the cost that the hospital systems have spent money on in the last several years is administrative burden. There has been significant amount of prior auth and denial work that the hospitals have had to deal with ultimately greater than 90% of those prior auths and denials being overturned. We need help in having those issues be resolved.
I would rather that we spend our time and energy actually lifting the hood analyzing with comprehensive data and driving efficiency in the system, patient-centered, that really is about right care, right time, right setting. When we look at individuals who are stuck in our hospital beds because we can't get timely authorizations, $500 million in preventable expense because they are in the highest cost. People who are going to the emergency department because they cannot get into a primary care physician, and it is a primary care need that they have. Evidence-based research, evidence-based protocols and adherence to those protocols. I think there's great opportunity to get billions of dollars of spend out of the system, and I would much prefer we spend our time and energy there.
Anna?
I think we can all agree that insurance companies are the problem. No, I'm just kidding. But if we're looking for common ground, I think that, there are a lot of places, and, this is our job, is to come up with places where we can agree in a bipartisan manner that, that cuts can be made in order to reinvest and to reduce the deficit. I think, we recently published a report that we publish annually saying that Medicare Advantage is overpaid by $1.2 trillion over 10 years. So, let's go for it. We can do this. Other places, program integrity, capping prices, that exists, and that is happening in some places. Reforming how we pay for Part B drugs. I could keep going on MA. Egg whips. Talk to me later. So I think there are a lot of ideas out there and places that we can find common ground. And, I just want to emphasize that for us, the goal here is so that, so that my kids can have the kind of care that, our doctors are providing. That's what I want. And unfortunately, if we continue at this pace, we are crowding out opportunities for innovation and for care in the future.
So I think from a fiscal standpoint, so there are sort of two pieces that I think I really want to dwell on. Is first, from a fiscal standpoint, I think there's a lot that we can do. I think we have an immense amount of data that we don't know what to do with. I think that there's both spend data and utilization data. I think the fragmented nature, we were talking about fragmentation of care, the fragmented nature on how hospital systems are regulated. We've mentioned 3 different rules that all apply to various health systems depending on the sites of care that they provide, and that's not including the other 12 or so that are CMS rules that are updated annually. And I think thinking about what we can do with the data that we have and the regulatory environment in which we get that data is really important. I think that will reduce some of the administrative burden. I think we'll have an opportunity to find savings. But I also don't want to say that this is only the federal government's problem. Obviously, it's a Medicare. This is a Medicare policy. Site neutrality is inherently predominantly a Medicare policy, and Medicare is for the feds. But some of the things that we talk about, the consolidation, some of the antitrust pieces, actually can be affected at a state level. There is an opportunity for the certificate of need laws of various states to be looked at and addressed. That doesn't have a whole lot to do with federal rulemaking and federal laws, but it's an equally important lever that we don't maybe need an immense amount of time and energy spent in Congress that ends up getting bogged down, and that instead we can actually move some things through the process because we know that we don't have to address every single thing all at the same time. And then the last thing I'll say is to sort of cap on one of what we talked about is the bystander capacity, which is a more technical term of what we were talking about. And I think that that's an important consideration. It's an important consideration for access to care. It's an important consideration for the financial aspect of things. But again, I think that there's an opportunity to address that, and site neutrality, enacting levels of site neutrality in some capacity would potentially allow a slight market reset to find sustainable long-term solutions to address the issues that the hospitals have raised.
Well, I think we may have found a little bit of common consensus here, Congressman.
Chris Jones, you've definitely taken steps down that pathway, for sure. Ladies and gentlemen, a big round of applause for Pathway to Consensus, panel number 2. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll just stand up. Dr. Mishra and Secretary, if we'll stand up, we're going to get our picture made before we turn you loose and let you out in the world. Dr. Mishra did a great job. Thank you so much. Madam Secretary.
Always a pleasure.
All right, we're all going to come in. You guys come in right there. We're going to let's go. Stay right there. We're going to get these flags. That makes the perfect backdrop. Here we go. Here we go. Thank you very much, panelists. Thank you so much. As we go, we've got nobody's going anywhere because we've got our main event, ladies and gentlemen. Although the first 2 panels were heavyweight slugfests when it comes to health policy, for sure. I forgot to tell our panelists that these seats can get kind of warm sometimes, especially when they're facing that way. They got red hot last week if you saw the health executive series, whatnot, which is fantastic. As we welcome our final keynote speaker, I'm told that I give tours sometimes in the chamber, and there are members giving speeches to an empty chamber. And I remind everybody, they're really not talking to an empty chamber. They're talking to the American people, because these cameras right here, with social media, with technology, you're really talking to the American people. And the American people are listening right now what's happening in this room in particular when it comes to healthcare. So we're making... It may be smaller than we want, but we are making progress towards building that consensus. If we were to do it in a way, maybe it's not the regular way to go. Maybe it's through reconciliation. We went through that earlier last year. Could there be a healthcare policy reconciliation bill? Could it be? What would it look like? Well, we went to the top think tank on the Hill to get a vision, and they said, we got to send you this upcoming speaker. EPIC, if you've heard of EPIC, it's the Economic Policy Innovation. What's the C? Center. Of course it's center. Everybody knows. I'm just keeping our audience awake. The EPIC is everything healthcare and just thinkers. How about that? Top policy thinkers. The thinker they sent us today is a former deputy chief of staff for Congresswoman Ashley Hinson. She's done great things all over the Hill today. She's going to talk about what it looks like. Would you please welcome, ladies and gentlemen, Miss Brittany Madney. Brittany, come on up. Thank you so much for being here. Hooray. All right. It's good to see you. And thank you so much.
You.
Kisses. All right.
Yeah.
Go get them. Good luck.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
All right. I don't know how I'm supposed to follow an introduction like that. I mean, come on. You're setting me up for something crazy. But I guess that's the point of Reconciliation 2.0, right? It's kind of the big introduction we've already had with the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, and how do we have a repeat performance that is worthy of the American people? That's the question that we're faced with today. When Congressman Bean asked me to do this keynote, one of the things he said to me was that he wanted me to talk about the recipe for success in a second reconciliation package. I have a one-word answer for you, and I intentionally didn't tell you beforehand. It's freedom. That's the answer. It's the answer to everything. It's the answer to why we even have this country. It's the answer to why the One Big Beautiful Bill Act was a success. It's the answer to why we got more in OB3 than just a short-term extension of the TCJA tax reform from 2017. It's the answer to what we could do next. Now, I'm sure you've all heard members, your bosses, talk about freedom this, freedom that. What does it really mean when we get down to it? It means that every policy we choose to engage in with Reconciliation 2.0 needs to have freedom at its core. That's how we're going to advance the ball, but it's also how we're going to find consensus. There needs to be a general theme for Reconciliation 2.0. I would suggest that there are two themes, or two buckets, within the larger theme of freedom. The first is what everybody in the country is talking about right now, It's what the President of the United States is talking about right now, affordability. We need to address the affordability crisis the American people are facing. That comes in a lot of different ways, a lot of different policy areas, many of which are within the jurisdiction of the Ways and Means Committee, whose room we're in right now. Some of those are things like housing affordability. Some of them are groceries and prices on the shelves when you need to buy school supplies for your kids. Childcare affordability. I can tell you I don't love how much I have to pay for my son in daycare. But one of the things that we're focused on today is healthcare. I know that we've had some great panelists talking about improving outcomes, improving access to care. The third piece of that is improving the affordability of care. It doesn't matter if Americans have coverage on paper if they can't access that care. One of the biggest problems that Americans face in terms of access to care is affordability. It's not affordable for them to go to the doctor even if they have coverage on paper, even if they have an insurance card. Another challenge on the affordability side isn't just their co-pays, isn't just their high deductibles, isn't just how much they have to pay in their monthly premiums to their insurance companies. It's also whether or not they can afford to take the day off work and drive to another county if they live in a rural community. It's if they can afford to hire a babysitter to watch the kids. It's if they can afford the gas to get somewhere else, because there is such a problem with provider access and closures, particularly in rural communities, although this is happening in suburban and urban areas as well. Big part of that is the consolidation crisis. So when I talk to you about affordability, when you hear great ideas coming out of panelists, whether today or at the last event, on affordability and on access to care and on making sure that the American people can actually get the care they need and we can improve outcomes, that doesn't just mean lowering prices. It means rethinking the entire system. The good news is we have a way to do that. It's called reconciliation. Through reconciliation, we can do things that you cannot do otherwise. You get to touch programs that you don't touch in the annual appropriations bills because you're dealing with the autopilot or mandatory side of the spending ledger. You're not just restrained to discretionary spending that your boss gets to vote on once a year. You're looking at potentially reconfiguring big programs, the ACA, Medicare, Medicaid. You're looking at systemic change opportunities here. I know that's scary to a lot of members. I know a lot of staff, I know a lot of folks downtown immediately jump back at that and think, no, don't touch anything, because what if we make it worse? We could make it worse. And we don't want to be accused of cuts. Cuts would be really bad. Well, I would suggest to you that spending almost 10% of our GDP on healthcare as just the government share hasn't gotten us anywhere. It just hasn't. In fact, maybe that's not even right. Maybe it's gotten us backwards. Maybe we've gone in the wrong direction. Right now, let me put this into context for you. The government is sitting on $38.5 trillion with a T dollars in debt. Our national debt is $38.5 trillion. With a T. What does that mean? There are real implications for that. The number is so big, it's almost hard to fathom how that's real. Well, a huge portion of our spending is through the healthcare side of the budget. In fact, it's the largest part of our spending if you add up the various health components. But that's not even the whole picture, because we're also spending $1.22 trillion on interest payments for the national debt. So think about your credit card at home, and if you don't pay your credit card bill, not only do you have your principal that you have to pay, your principal balance, but you also have to keep paying interest on that monthly, and it stacks and it gets higher and higher, and rates are impacted by that, and eventually things are all going to collapse. It's a house of cards. Well, that's what's happening with the United States. We have a $38.5 trillion debt, and our annual interest payment, just our credit card payment last year, was $1.22 trillion. Now, I'm looking at some blank faces in the room because it's a number that's so big. How does that even matter? Like, what does it mean? Let me give you some context here. There are only 16 countries in the world whose entire GDPs are larger than just our credit card bill, just the interest payments. There are only 16 countries. The 17th country is Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia's entire economy is equal to the size of our interest payments just last year. Now, I would guess that most of your bosses would say Saudi Arabia is a pretty wealthy state. Well, that's how much we're paying just on our interest payments. The biggest portion of our federal budget is health care, particularly when you add up the different portions and our interest. Our interest payment alone has outpaced every program in the federal budget except for Social Security. We pay more on interest than on Medicare, than on all of national defense. Why am I telling you this when we're supposed to be talking about Reconciliation 2.0? Because the purpose of reconciliation, the reason we have reconciliation as an option in budget world is to address the federal debt and deficit situation. That's why we have it. That's why there are so many rules and parameters for reconciliation. That's why you don't play in discretionary spending. You focus on the mandatory side of the ledger. It's why there's the Byrd Rule in the Senate and the 7 tests of the Byrd Rule that all have to make sure that each and every provision of reconciliation is focused primarily on the budget. If a provision is not primarily budgetary in nature, it's kicked. It gets bounced right on out of the package. So when we're looking at reconciliation as a way to improve affordability for all Americans, when we're looking at reconciliation as a way to address the crises that Americans are facing, you have to keep in mind a few things. You have to make sure that you're thinking first and foremost about the debt and deficit picture. Because if you're not, then whatever you're trying to do is not reconcilable. This is a challenge in many ways. It's why some of the provisions in the One Big Beautiful Bill Act's initial schematics didn't actually make it to the final cut. Now, some of those were great provisions that we just didn't have the time to argue and weren't quite ripe yet, and others were jettisoned because they didn't meet the standards of reconciliation. Because again, this is really about getting the federal budget under control, putting us on a more sustainable path. The second thing you need to keep in mind when we're looking at a reconciliation bill is your purpose. Why are you doing what you're doing? What's the goal? What's the message to the American people? Talked a lot about affordability as one of the things you want to attack in a reconciliation bill. Make sure we're addressing that concern of the people. That's a pathway to a goal, but I would say that the goal continues to be freedom. It continues to be honoring why the American people put your bosses in their seats. So thinking about affordability, start considering some free market options. How do we get to a better healthcare system that's more affordable, that provides actual coverage and access instead of just a number on a piece of paper, right? Coverage doesn't equal care. We're talking about access. We're talking about outcomes. We're talking about putting decisions back in patients' hands. We're talking about making sure that there's a future that can be reached. This is the American dream. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about why we need to do a reconciliation bill. Now, there's another pathway that I would encourage you to look at. Look at the low-hanging fruit. I just talked to you about our massive debt and deficit and the problems that that causes the American people. Well, there's a lot of waste, fraud, and abuse in the federal budget. A really depressing amount of improper payments, in particular, comes out of the healthcare programs. Start looking at ways to improve program integrity. This is something that everyone can agree on. Consensus is needed on this front. Start looking at ways to confirm eligibility for these programs. Think about ways to clean up the rolls. There were some steps taken for Medicaid program integrity, restrictions on eligibility and improvement in the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. I know a lot of folks have said that there are a lot of cuts to Medicaid in the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. I'll just dispel that myth right now. After the One Big Beautiful Bill Act was enacted into law, Medicaid's projected growth continues to be 31% higher. 31% higher. So for anyone saying that there are Medicaid cuts, you should feel confident in responding, no, that's just Washington math. That's Washington math saying that we're now only growing at 31% more spending. That's not a cut. That's an increase. You should be thinking about that when you're looking at options for the second reconciliation package as well. What can you do to actually improve healthcare policy? And how do those options drive down costs for the American people while cutting waste, fraud, and abuse? Making sure that the spending people are expecting the government to be responsible with actually matches their priorities while giving them the opportunity to access the care they need. Now, there are options for this. I've got some of my favorites. I know you heard some today. I know you heard some last week. But I'll give you a few. The first I'll mention, I won't talk a lot about because I know it was the subject of the first panel at your last series event, which is addressing the Obamacare subsidies, the premium tax credits. So that's certainly something that needs to be considered. Honestly, it's not a tax credit, and the way that the system is set up, so those dollars go directly to insurers rather than patients, skews the entire process. This also feeds really neatly into the problem of care consolidation, which is part of why healthcare is so inaccessible, because you have consolidation of care, often through these major insurance companies. So you start seeing closures of alternate care points, alternate provider options. So that's one option for you to consider that addresses affordability. It addresses what EPIC would call legal fraud. It addresses freedom, and it's reconcilable. Think about how you could either eliminate or improve the flow of the premium tax credit so that it actually works for the American people. Another option for you to consider is one that the White House has been really enthusiastic about, that RSC Chairman Pfluger has released a bill on in concert with Senator Rick Scott of Florida. Florida shout out. That is expanding HSA options. HSAs are incredibly popular across the country because it's allowing people to use their money in a tax-privileged way for what they choose to improve their own health care. We could expand HSAs, and it could be what President Trump has proposed of transferring the PTC into an HSA, or it could be just expanding eligibility otherwise, letting HSAs be used for more options, letting people use their HSAs beyond just the typical thinking for medical costs. Maybe you want to use your HSA for a membership at a gym or at a healthcare facility that's going to encourage preventative care. There are lots of ways to expand eligibility for HSAs, but we also don't want to just look at what HSAs are used for. We want to look at who can have them. So let's start opening up the option so that you can have a health savings account, even if your traditional insurance plan didn't provide it as part of the benefit package. Maybe we should offer catastrophic plans and allow an HSA alongside that. That might get more people access to care rather than just coverage. I would also suggest that you think carefully about some of the Medicare reforms. I know nobody wants to talk about Medicare. It's dangerous. It's the third rail of politics. But you heard some great ideas today. I believe you talked about site neutrality today. Site neutrality is common sense. It's common sense. There are consensus ways to do it. There are different options on the table. And it's a big saver. It's a huge saver. We're talking hundreds of billions of dollars, depending on the way that it's written. And then finally, I would also say there is a lot of inherent unfairness in the Medicaid program. Medicaid was designed to support America's most vulnerable, the most vulnerable population, the needy women and children who really needed support. Right now, the way Medicaid is written, states are encouraged, again, this is coming back to the program integrity concern, states are encouraged to put individuals who are not the most vulnerable on their Medicaid rolls. The reason they're encouraged is because states get a bigger match from the federal government if you're a 27-year-old healthy man sitting in your mother's basement instead of working. States get more money for you if you're on Medicaid than they do for someone under the poverty line. A pregnant single mom under the poverty line will get less money than that healthy 27-year-old who could be working. That's a problem. That's unfair. That's not part of the American dream. That's not lifting up the people who need the program the most. That's wasting Americans' taxpayer money where they don't even know it's going. And it's a negative incentive. It's a perverse incentive to states. You can change the FMAP structure in several different ways. You can ratchet it higher, lower. I'm happy to talk to anybody who wants some of those suggestions. One of my favorites is that Washington, D.C. automatically gets a higher federal match rate than anywhere else. Everywhere else is based on a formula. Everywhere else gets their federal match based on a formula, not D.C. D.C. automatically gets all the money that they could want. Why? Why should bureaucrats in D.C. automatically get more than the poor pregnant woman with a child that she's trying to support in your boss's district? It makes no sense. So I say this to share with you that there are lots of opportunities that really could be consensus-driven. There are things in the federal budget that we can do to drive down costs that are all reconcilable, that improve affordability, improve coverage, improve care access instead of just coverage, and most importantly, we can reconcile our way to freedom. Thank you.
Brittany Madney, well done. Hooray. Thank you so much. Let's all, I think it was epic, your speech, pun intended. Thank you. We got lots to talk about. And it's funny, the policy of you discuss it about everybody should have an HSA. What if we did that? What if we let everybody take control of their own health care? It's a bean bill. How about that? We've already filed that bill, but we think that'll be a key ingredient going forward as we work on coming up with a plan for healthcare. About to turn you loose. We're just literally 45 seconds from dismissing everybody. But first, my team. I want to recognize my team. And they're important because if you want to participate or have a topic you think an ingredient that needs to be in that healthcare plan that we've talked about, then you need to get with the Bean team. One is Richie Lemura. Richie, wave your hand right there. Let everybody see you. Thank you very much, Richie. And he is our legal counsel, but he's also everything healthcare. And then our director of legislative policy for the Bean team is James Thomas. James, give him a wave. How about that? Thank you so much. And how about who walked in sitting on the side is our chief of staff, Jamie Robinette. Jamie, good to see you as well. So ladies and gentlemen, thank you. I know it's a long day. I know you got snow to shovel back home. We're going to get you out there right now. Thank you for being a part of the Pathway series. We look forward to seeing you back here very, very soon. If we can do something, let us know. Have a great day. Let's go get them. All the best. Brittany, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Have a great time.